It was the kind of afternoon that should have felt unremarkable, a cloudless sky stretched wide over a small-town grocery store, its parking lot bustling with the quiet rhythms of ordinary life. Ethan Harris, seated in his dark gray sedan, paused a moment before opening the door. His hand rested on the steering wheel, his fingers tracing absent patterns against the leather as he prepared to step out. The handicap placard hanging from his rearview mirror swayed gently in the breeze filtering through the open window. To most, it was just another piece of plastic. But to Ethan, it carried the weight of a lifetime of battles fought far from home and the silent struggles that came after. Ethan adjusted his prosthetic limb under the fabric of his jeans, then reached for the cane beside him. Every movement was deliberate, measured. A slight shift in his posture revealed a flicker of discomfort, but his expression betrayed nothing. For Ethan, life had become a dance of discipline and quiet endurance, a lesson in resilience honed over years of hardship. As he stepped out of the car, the faint sound of laughter drifted from a few spaces away. It was the kind of laughter that lingered just long enough to make itself noticed. "Well, would you look at that?" a man's voice called out, not bothering to lower its volume. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze catching a group of four standing near a sleek black SUV. They were well dressed, coffee cups in hand, the ease of their confidence evident in the way they leaned against their car. The man who had spoken, tall, wearing mirrored sunglasses, smirked as if waiting for someone to agree with him. "Faking a disability just to park closer," the man continued, his voice carrying over the hum of passing cars. Ethan froze, the words sharp enough to cut through the otherwise serene afternoon. He inhaled deeply, his military training reminding him to steady his breath, to keep his emotions in check. "Probably bought that placard online," another voice added, this time a woman's, smooth and mocking. She held her coffee delicately, her manicured fingers resting lightly against the cup's cardboard sleeve. The others in the group laughed softly, the sound mingling with the chirping of sparrows perched on nearby lampposts. Ethan's grip on his cane tightened. He thought of the medals stored away in a box at home, the years spent in service of a country that often overlooked men like him. He thought of the doctors who had worked to save his leg, and the moment they told him they couldn't. He thought of all the times he'd felt unseen, unheard, despite everything he had given. But Ethan had learned long ago that anger served no purpose. The world had a way of revealing itself in small, biting moments like this, and his role was to endure it quietly, with dignity intact. He glanced at the group again, their laughter fading as they turned back to their conversation. Ignoring the prickling heat at the back of his neck, he began the slow walk toward the store's entrance. Each step was a reminder of the body he had fought to adapt to, the sacrifices he bore invisibly. Inside the store, the air was cool and still. Ethan moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, selecting milk, bread, and a few other essentials before heading to the pharmacy. The interaction with the cashier was brief, perfunctory, just another transaction in a day that felt like it should have been ordinary. But as Ethan left the store and approached his car, he saw it. A mess of eggs and shattered shells streaked across the windshield and hood, dripping yolk pooling near the wipers. He stopped, his heart sinking as he took in the scene. From across the parking lot came a familiar laugh, sharper this time, cutting through the silence like a blade. The group was still there, leaning against their SUV, their expressions smug and unrepentant. "Looks like you've got some car trouble," the tall man called out, his grin wide. "Maybe you shouldn't park in spots meant for people who actually need them." Ethan's chest tightened, his pulse quickening. He adjusted his grip on the cane, its cool metal steadying him. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the accusation hang in the air between them. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he turned toward them. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, but carried an unmistakable weight. "Why would you do this?" The laughter faltered, the woman in the designer jacket shrugging as she sipped her coffee. "Because you're a fraud," she said simply, as though it were fact. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unchanging. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his tone even. "But this is a crime." The tall man stepped closer, his smirk unwavering. "The only crime here is you pretending to be something you're not." In the distance, The faint sound of sirens broke through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the group as they began to shift uneasily. For the first time that afternoon, Ethan felt something other than anger, something deeper, quieter. It wasn't satisfaction or relief. It was the simple knowledge that truth, though often slow, had a way of catching up. And the sirens kept coming. The sirens drew nearer, their distant wails slicing through the stillness of the afternoon. Ethan Harris stood by his car, his cane planted firmly on the asphalt as he watched the group of strangers who had turned his ordinary errand into an act of defiance. They stood together, their laughter now muted, their earlier bravado replaced with an uneasy restlessness. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his prosthetic limb hidden beneath his jeans feeling heavier than usual. He didn't want to be here, under the sharp gaze of passers-by and the growing judgment of a crowd. All he wanted was to go home. But the eggs dripping from his windshield and the sneering faces of his accusers made it clear that leaving wasn't an option, not yet. The first police car rolled into the lot, its blue lights flashing silently. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp against the backdrop of the bustling parking lot. One, a tall woman with a steady, professional demeanor, approached Ethan first. The other lingered by the patrol car, speaking briefly into the radio before scanning the crowd. "Sir," the tall officer began, her voice calm but firm. "Can I see your ID and your handicap placard?" Ethan nodded, his movements slow as he reached into his wallet and retrieved his military ID. He handed it to her silently, then gestured toward the placard hanging from his rearview mirror. The officer inspected both, her expression unreadable, while the group of accusers stood a few paces away, their voices rising again. "He's faking it," the tall man Gavin, as one of his friends had called him earlier, shouted, gesturing wildly toward Ethan. "That guy doesn't look disabled. He just parked here to take advantage of the spot." The woman in the designer jacket chimed in, her tone sharp and dismissive. "We called him out, and he got aggressive. That's why we had to get the police involved." Ethan remained silent, his gaze steady on the officer. He had heard words like these before, accusations wrapped in entitlement, delivered with the confidence of people who believed they'd never be questioned. Years of experience had taught him that responding with anger only fanned the flames. So he stood still, letting the noise swirl around him. The officer turned back to him, her eyes briefly scanning his face before dropping to his legs. "Sir," she asked, her voice quieter now, "is there anything you'd like to say?" For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, with a deliberate motion, he bent down and rolled up his right pant leg. The bright afternoon sun glinted off the metallic frame of his prosthetic limb, its polished surface a stark contrast to the dull gray of the asphalt. A hush fell over the parking lot. The murmurs of onlookers stopped abruptly, replaced by an almost tangible silence. Even the group of accusers froze, their expressions shifting from confidence to confusion. Ethan straightened, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet resolve. "I earned this spot," he said, his voice low but steady. "I lost my leg while serving this country. I don't need to justify myself to anyone." The officer nodded, her posture softening as she handed back his ID. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice laced with a sincerity that cut through the tension. "We had no idea." Behind her, Gavin's smirk faltered, his bravado wilting under the weight of the prosthetic's undeniable truth. The woman in the designer jacket took a step back, her mouth opening as if to speak. But no words came. "Perfectly fine." "Huh?" an older man from the gathering crowd muttered, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. The officer turned to the group, her expression hardening. "What you've done here is vandalism and harassment," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This is a serious matter, and you'll need to come with us for questioning." Gavin started to protest, his voice rising again. "We didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke." "Was it?" Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "You vandalized my car. You insulted me. You called the police on me. You meant every word." The officer signaled to her partner, who moved toward the group, handcuffs visible on his belt. The entitled laughter that had filled the air earlier was gone now, replaced by the quiet shuffle of feet and murmurs of disbelief from the crowd. Ethan watched as the group was led toward the patrol car, their earlier arrogance stripped away, leaving behind only the awkward reality of their actions. The knot of tension in his chest loosened slightly, though the weight of the day still pressed heavily on his shoulders. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a woman stepping forward, a package of paper towels in hand. Her face was soft with apology, her steps tentative as she approached him. "Here," she said quietly, offering the towels. "Let me help you clean this up." Ethan hesitated, then accepted the gesture with a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Around him, others began to move, their initial curiosity replaced with a quiet determination to right the wrongs they had witnessed. A man fetched a bottle of water from his car. Another offered to call a mobile detailing service. Slowly, the collective shame of the crowd turned into action, their efforts an unspoken acknowledgement of what Ethan had endured. As the last of the egg was wiped from his windshield, Ethan took a deep breath, his grip on the cane relaxing slightly. The officer returned, handing him a small envelope with a business card inside. "There's a car wash down the road," she said. "Please let me cover it. It's the least I can do." Ethan studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady but tired. He glanced at the sky as he prepared to leave, the sun still shining brightly over the lot. It was a quiet kind of irony, he thought, that such an ordinary day could hold so much. Yet even in the face of ignorance and prejudice, there was resilience and perhaps, he realized, a sliver of hope. By the time Ethan Harris pulled into his driveway that evening, the weight of the day settled over him like an unwelcome companion. The rhythmic hum of his car's engine had done little to quiet his thoughts. As he turned off the ignition and stared at the modest house before him, the reflection of the setting sun glinted faintly on his windshield, highlighting a few stubborn streaks where the egg residue remained. He sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly for a moment before reaching for his cane. The house was quiet when he entered. Naomi, his wife, must have been in the kitchen, the soft clink of plates and the warm, familiar scent of stew greeted him as he stepped inside. "You're late," she called out, her voice calm but concerned. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He placed his cane by the door and slipped off his shoes, the simple act more laborious than it used to be. When he finally made his way into the kitchen, Naomi turned to face him, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the weariness etched across his face. "What happened?" she asked, setting down the ladle in her hand. Ethan hesitated. It wasn't that he wanted to hide the truth, he simply wasn't sure how to begin. The day's events still felt surreal, the edges of his emotions too sharp to articulate. "There was an incident at the store," he said finally, his voice measured. "Some people didn't think I belonged in a handicap spot. They made a scene." Naomi's brow furrowed, her hands moving instinctively to rest on her hips. "What do you mean, a scene?" "They egged my car," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, stark and heavy. Naomi stared at him for a moment, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "They what?" she said, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. Ethan walked to the table and sank into a chair, the familiar creak of the wood beneath him grounding him in the present. "It's over now," he said, his tone deliberate. "The police came. They handled it." Naomi pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, her gaze searching his face. "But it's not over, is it?" she asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. His prosthetic limb felt heavier than usual, a subtle reminder of all the years he'd spent fighting battles that never truly seemed to end. "It's not about the car," he said after a long pause. "It's about what they saw or didn't see. They looked at me and decided who I was before I even opened my mouth. They decided I was a liar, a fraud, someone who didn't deserve the space I was standing in." Naomi reached across the table and placed a hand over his, her grip firm. "You don't have to justify yourself to people like that," she said softly. Ethan nodded, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. It wasn't the first time he'd faced something like this, and he doubted it would be the last. The world had a way of making itself clear, even in the quiet moments, perhaps especially in the quiet moments. Later that evening, As they sat together in the living room, the television flickered with images from the news. Ethan wasn't paying attention at first, his thoughts still circling the events of the day. But then he heard his name. He turned toward the screen, his brow furrowing as he recognized the parking lot of the grocery store. A bystander had recorded the incident, the video now circulating on social media. The footage showed him standing by his car, calm and composed, as the police officer examined his ID. It captured the moment he revealed his prosthetic limb. The murmurs of the crowd audible even through the grainy audio. Naomi glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It's everywhere," she said softly. Ethan didn't respond. He watched as the news anchor recounted the story, their voice measured and polished. There was outrage in their tone, not at him, but at the group who had vandalized his car and accused him without cause. The story had become a talking point, a symbol of something larger than the single afternoon it occupied. The grocery store's owner had issued a statement, condemning the actions of the group and pledging a donation to a veterans charity in Ethan's name. Social media was alight with commentary, much of it supportive, though Ethan knew from experience that not all voices would be kind. As the segment ended, Naomi reached for the remote and turned off the television. "You stood up for yourself," she said, breaking the silence. "And now people are paying attention." Ethan leaned back against the couch, his gaze fixed on the darkened screen. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel vindicated. What he felt, more than anything, was exhaustion and all-encompassing weariness that came from knowing that, even with the world watching, the quiet battles would continue. "They shouldn't need a video to see the truth," he said finally. Naomi squeezed his hand, her grip a silent reassurance. "No," she agreed, "but maybe this will make them think twice before judging someone else." Ethan nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but the thought brought a small measure of comfort. For now, that would have to be enough. As the house grew quiet around them, Ethan closed his eyes and let the events of the day fade into the background. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another chance to navigate the world with the quiet dignity he'd learned to carry. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment to rest. The morning after the incident, the air felt cooler, calmer. Ethan Harris sat on the porch, his coffee cup resting in his hand as he watched the neighborhood wake up. The distant sound of a lawnmower hummed steadily, a rhythm of normalcy that felt oddly soothing after the upheaval of the previous day. A light breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree in the front yard. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the street, where his car sat, now clean but still carrying the faintest shadow of the vandalism. The memory of the egg-streaked windshield lingered, though it was no longer the mess that weighed on him. What stayed with him, heavier and harder to shake, was the look in their eyes, the quiet certainty of the group's judgment. Their unshakable belief that they were right, even as they were so clearly wrong. Naomi stepped outside, her robe tied loosely around her waist, and sat beside him. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. Naomi didn't press him. They sat together in companionable silence for a while, the porch creaking faintly beneath their chairs. It wasn't until she reached for her own cup, left on the small table between them, that she broke the quiet. "That video," she said. "It's everywhere now. I saw it again this morning." Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I know," Naomi replied, "but maybe it's not such a bad thing. People are talking about it, about what happened, about what it means." Ethan shook his head. "What does it change? Those people didn't care about the truth. They saw what they wanted to see. And now, what? A few strangers online get angry for a day or two, and then it's forgotten?" Naomi studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but maybe it plants a seed. Maybe someone sees it and thinks twice the next time they make an assumption." Ethan didn't respond. He wanted to believe her, but the weariness in his chest made it hard. He had spent too many years confronting the same silent barriers, too many moments feeling the weight of being judged by a world that didn't truly see him. As they sat together, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew their attention. A sedan with the logo of the local news station on the side came to a stop. and a young woman stepped out, holding a small camera and a notepad. Ethan frowned, his fingers tightening slightly around the arm of his chair. Naomi reached over, her hand resting gently on his. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to talk to them if you don't want to." The woman approached, her steps cautious, her expression respectful. "Mr. Harris?" she asked, stopping at the edge of the porch. Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze steady but guarded. "My name is Julia Monroe. I'm a reporter with the local news. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about what happened yesterday." Ethan considered her for a moment before shaking his head. "I'm not interested in telling my story," he said simply. Julia hesitated, then nodded. "I understand," she said, "but for what it's worth, I think it's an important story. Not just what happened, but how you handled it. A lot of people could learn from that." Ethan looked at her, searching for any trace of insincerity, but found none. After a moment, he nodded. "Thank you," he said, his tone soft but firm. Julia offered a small smile before turning back to her car. As she drove away, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavier than before. "Maybe she's right," Naomi said after a while. Ethan glanced at her. "About what?" "About people learning from it," she replied. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed them dignity. That's not something people forget easily." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as a neighbor walked past, their dog trotting happily at their side. The neighbor, an older man Ethan recognized but didn't know well, gave him a small nod as he passed. "Morning, Ethan," he called out. Ethan raised a hand in greeting, surprised by the warmth in the man's voice. He couldn't recall the last time they'd exchanged more than a brief wave. As the day went on, similar moments unfolded. A young man from down the street knocked on the door, offering to help with the yard work Ethan hadn't gotten to in weeks. A woman from the grocery store called to apologize for not stepping in sooner, explaining that she hadn't known how. Each gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but together they began to form something Ethan hadn't expected: a sense of being seen. Not for the first time, but in a way that felt different. That evening, as Ethan sat with Naomi in the quiet of their living room, the television played softly in the background. Another news segment featured the video, the anchor's voice calm as they recounted the incident and the community's response. Naomi reached for his hand, her grip steady. "You didn't ask for this," she said, echoing his earlier words. "But maybe it's exactly what people needed to see." Ethan didn't reply, but as he looked at her, the faintest flicker of hope stirred within him. Perhaps, he thought, she was right, and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, it mattered. In the days that followed, Ethan Harris found himself at the center of a conversation he hadn't asked to start. The video of the parking lot confrontation continued to circulate, reaching places and people far beyond the small town where it had occurred. Strangers sent messages, some supportive, others critical, but Ethan avoided the noise, preferring instead to focus on the rhythms of his daily life. Still, the world outside seemed eager to remind him of the moment he had tried so hard to move past. At the grocery store, a cashier handed him his receipt with a knowing smile, her voice tinged with something like admiration. "Saw you on the news," she said. "Good for you, standing up like that." Ethan nodded politely, offering a faint smile before walking away. It wasn't just the grocery store. At the gas station, a middle-aged man pumping fuel 2 lanes over gave him a thumbs up, his expression earnest. Even at the post office, where Ethan had always been able to slip in and out unnoticed, someone approached him to say they'd been moved by his story. "You're a good man," the older woman said, clutching her purse tightly as she spoke. "The world could use more like you." Ethan thanked her quietly, but the weight of these interactions lingered. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like anything special. What he had done, standing his ground, telling the truth, was simply what needed to be done. That others saw it differently only deepened the quiet frustration that had followed him since the incident. One afternoon, as Ethan sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the wind play through the trees, he noticed a car pull up to the curb in front of his house. He recognized the vehicle immediately. Officer Karen Lopez stepped out, her uniform replaced with jeans and a simple blazer. Ethan stood, setting his cup down as she approached. "Officer Lopez," he said, nodding in greeting. "Just Karen today," she replied with a small smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ethan shook his head, gesturing for her to take a seat on the porch. She hesitated briefly before sitting, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, her tone measured, "about how quickly we almost got it wrong, about how easy it was to believe what those people were saying." Ethan didn't respond immediately, letting her words settle in the quiet air between them. He appreciated her honesty, though it did little to ease the memories of that day. "I think it's human nature to judge," he said finally, "to look at someone and make assumptions. But those assumptions can hurt more than people realize." Karen nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I've been a cop for over 15 years. She said. "I've seen plenty of situations where things weren't what they seemed. You'd think I'd know better by now." Ethan glanced at her, his expression calm but firm. "It's not just about knowing better," he said. "It's about doing better." Karen looked down at her hands, nodding slowly. "You're right," she said, "and I wanted to say thank you. For your patience. For how you handled it. A lot of people wouldn't have." Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. "I've had a lot of practice," he said simply. For a moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the neighborhood filling the space between them. Children's laughter echoed faintly from down the street, and the hum of a lawnmower droned steadily in the distance. Finally, Karen stood, brushing her hands against her jeans. "I won't take up any more of your time," she said. "I just wanted to say what I came here to say." Ethan stood as well, nodding politely. "Thank you for coming," he said. As she walked back to her car, Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. He wasn't sure if Karen's words would change anything, but he appreciated the effort. Later that evening, as Ethan and Naomi sat together watching the news, another segment about the incident aired. This time, it included interviews with people from the community, neighbors, bystanders, even the grocery store owner. "I think it's a reminder," one man said, his voice steady. "We can't just assume we know someone's story. We've got to listen. We've got to do better." Ethan turned off the television after the segment ended, the remote resting heavily in his hand. Naomi looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Ethan leaned back, his gaze fixed on the window where the faint outline of the moon was visible. "I'm thinking the world's a complicated place," he said finally. "But maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to make it better." Naomi reached for his hand, her touch grounding him as the weight of the day settled into the quiet of the evening. And for the first time in days, Ethan felt something close to peace. A week after the incident, life had begun to settle back into something resembling normal for Ethan Harris. The messages and news segments had slowed, the curiosity of the town waning as new stories filled the headlines. Yet, even as the world moved on, Ethan carried the weight of the experience with him, a reminder of how easily assumptions could unravel the fragile threads of respect and understanding. It was a crisp morning when Ethan decided to return to the grocery store. The air held the faint chill of approaching autumn, and the sky was painted a pale blue, as if the world itself was exhaling. Naomi had insisted he didn't need to go, offering to pick up what they needed. But Ethan knew he had to. Avoiding the place felt too much like giving in, and that wasn't something he was willing to do. As he pulled into the parking lot, his car gliding smoothly into the same handicap space as before, Ethan noticed how much quieter it seemed today. The usual hum of shoppers and passing cars was there, but the weight of the crowd's eyes that he'd felt so acutely last week was gone. He stepped out of the car, leaning lightly on his cane, and made his way toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open, and the cool air of the store washed over him, a small comfort in its familiarity. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," the cashier said as he passed, her voice warm and genuine. Ethan nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating the kindness but keeping his stride steady. As he moved through the aisles, he noticed the way people looked at him, not with the sharp curiosity of strangers seeking a story, but with something quieter, softer. A woman in her 70s gave him a small smile as they passed in the bread aisle. A young father, balancing a toddler on his hip, nodded respectfully when their carts crossed paths. It wasn't that everyone suddenly knew him. Ethan realized. It was that they were seeing him differently now, not as a symbol or a story, but as a person. By the time he reached the checkout line, he felt a subtle lightness in his chest. Perhaps Naomi was right, he thought. Perhaps moments like these did plant seeds. Small shifts in perspective that, over time, could grow into something meaningful. Mr. Harris? The voice was unfamiliar but polite, and Ethan turned to see a man standing a few feet away. He was older, his silver hair neatly combed, and his posture carried the slight stiffness of age. Yes? Ethan replied, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. The man stepped closer, his hands clasped in front of him. I just wanted to say, thank you, he said, for how you handled yourself. For showing people like me that we still have a lot to learn. Ethan studied him for a moment, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, but found none. The man's words were simple, but they carried the weight of something deeply felt. You're welcome, Ethan said quietly. The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking a lot about it, the video. Everything. It made me realize how often I've looked at someone and made up my mind about them before they've even said a word. I don't want to do that anymore. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the man's words settle in the air between them, their quiet honesty enough to reach the part of him that still ached from the events of the week before. That's all any of us can do, Ethan said finally. Try to be better. The man extended his hand, and Ethan shook it briefly before watching him walk away. Later, as Ethan loaded his groceries into the car, he noticed a small group of people gathered near the edge of the parking lot. A middle-aged woman waved at him, her face familiar from one of the earlier news clips. Mr. Harris, she called out, walking over with a flyer in hand. We're organizing a community event next week, something to bring people together and talk about how we can be more understanding, more open. We'd love for you to join us. If you're interested. Ethan accepted the flyer, reading over the neatly printed details. It wasn't a grand event, just a gathering at the local library with coffee and conversation. But it felt like a step. Small but purposeful. I'll think about it, he said, and the woman nodded, her smile warm. Driving home, Ethan reflected on the morning. The world wasn't perfect. He knew. It never would be. But maybe it didn't have to be, not entirely. Maybe the small, quiet moments of change were enough to start something larger. Something better. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Naomi, the two of them watching the first stars emerge in the fading twilight, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. The world was still complicated, still heavy with its flaws, but it was also full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that perhaps, even in its quiet way, it was moving in the right direction.